Greetings, dear chess fans and experts. This is FIDE Master Max Omariev with you, and today we'll look at the World Blitz Championship, which ended ages ago, but very interesting games were left out. So today we'll look at the dark horse, the little-known Grandmaster from Russia, Alexey Sarana, who shocked both Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen. Let me remind you that in the 15th round, Magnus lost to Jan Nepomniachtchi, and in the 16th round, he wanted to return the favor and played against Vincent Keemer. We won't look at the game from the beginning, but we'll start from this position. As we can see, Magnus has the initiative on the king side. He wants to get to the opponent's king somehow. It's not quite clear how to do that. The h5 knight perfectly blocks all of white's offensive moves. Here, the white knight moves to f3 with some pressure on black's center. The pawns on d4 and e5 hang. And d3. Keemer plays recklessly. What's his idea? If the pawn takes d3, then after knight d3, rook d3, queen c2 check, and black wins the rook. So the world champion calmly plays rook c1, targeting the rook towards the queen, and e4, attacking the knight, but the knight moves to e1. Magnus Carlsen hunkers down, but for a time black's pawns begin to hang. Bishop e5. Vincent Keemer tries to exchange the white king's defenders. The queen moves to e5, but there's cd. The pawn center collapses, and after knight d3, Vincent blunders the c8 rook. He blunders the rook on c8 and has to give up. That's the game. Vincent was left without a rook in a couple of moves. As you can see, even super grandmasters can blunder. But Magnus's main competitor, Hikaru Nakamura, also had 11 points in his arsenal. His game with Alexander Grischuk was crucial. Alexander plays knight g7, rook e2, bishop c7 attacking the knight. The knight moves away with no problems. The position is more or less equal. Maybe white has a little better structure because the a5 pawn is isolated. The queen moves to e7, Alexander Grischuk starts to play too passively. Knight to g5, the f7 square is in danger. The rook moves to the f-file, the f7 pawn hangs. And queen d4 is a very bad retreat. The queen goes under the fork. Well, you'll see now. Hikaru plays rook f3, the f7 pawn hangs. What do? A few seconds on the clock. Rook d7 and rook takes f7. Instant hit. If we take the f7 rook, then knight f6 fork. And after that, the queen is lost. And that's how Alexander Grischuk played from equal position to defeat in a few moves. Nepo played a draw. Hikaru Nakamura won the game, and that's what we have now after 16 rounds. The three grandmasters, Hikaru Nakamura, Magnus Carlsen, and unexpectedly, Hikaru Nakamura are in the lead. But there's still 4 rounds to go, which could change everything. And of course, the centerpiece of the 17th round was a showdown between the two title match participants, Caruana and Magnus Carlsen. Let's see how it went. Fabiano got nothing in the opening as white. As we can see, the position is equal, but Magnus attacks, wants to create a weakness on the queen side. He exchanges more pieces and attacks the c3 pawn. It would seem that one weakness is not a problem. Just defend it and that's it, but the knight comes to the rescue. Knight d2 is not exactly a good move. He should have moved the knight through e3 to d5, and here Magnus Carlsen starts kicking it. Where should Fabi's knight go? And there's still a lot of time on the clock, more than a minute, but Fabi is in a hurry. Probably he's too confident in his actions. The position really looks strong. Knight c4 attacking the rook, rook a2, but that's the end of the knight's success. Of course, we can move it to e3, but there's going to be knight c5 and the e4 pawn will be in danger. The real problems begin. On king f3, knight g5 check. The pawns on h3 and e3 will hang. Coordination problems. What should he do? Rook d1 is an attempt at counterplay. Caruana prepares his rook for some invasions. So what should Magnus do? Magnus is looking for ways to press on the pawns. There are 2 obvious objects to attack. These are the pawns on e4 and c3. He could play knight c5, knight a4. This is the most obvious solution. Or he could cling to pawns with the rook, something like rook a4. But no, knight c5 is played by Magnus. The pawn hangs and it needs to be protected. If we go rook e1, then it's too passive. There are even some variations like knight d3 pop up. Playing king f3, why not? King f3 is the most kind of obvious move in this case, but there's going to be rook c2 and c3 pawn will be in danger. Fabi understands that he'll have to give up the pawn, as sad as it is. He plays rook d2. This is such a tricky move. If there's an exchange, then after knight d2, the knight protects the pawn. But rook a4 is played by Magnus. The knight retreats and that's it. The champ is up a pawn. Here it is, a masterful technique on the spot. From nothing he created an extra pawn, a central pawn. And now Fabiano will have to suffer until the end of the game. Of course, given the skills of the world champion, this suffering won't last very long because Magnus is a virtuoso in such positions. He aims at the f2 pawn. He decided whether to take the f2 pawn or the c3 pawn. It's clear that he'll lose the c7 pawn, but still. He can take on f2 and then on h3. This looks like the most logical, but white has a counter plan. Knight to f5, the g7 pawn will hang. Magnus understands this and therefore he's extremely focused. He calculates everything, and Magnus has been thinking about this move for almost a minute, so I sped up the video a little. But still, he dared to take the pawn on the f2 square. FIDE goes on the attack. Knight to f5 and now the g7 pawn hangs. What do we do here? Magnus takes the h3 pawn, rook takes g7 check. King to f8 and Fabiano takes the c7 pawn as well. In fact, his counter diversion was very successful. He took 2 pawns. h6 is weak, so Magnus plays h5. He doesn't want to give up on his edge pawn, which can become a passed pawn. And Fabiano begins to run out of time, less than 20 seconds on the clock. He's nervous and doesn't know which pawn to hunt for right now. He could either play rook h7 aiming at the h5 pawn, or try to attack the f6 pawn, go for something like c6. He plays king e3. Magnus is in a hurry with his knight to help the c-pawn. Maybe he's betting on a counterplay that the pawn will move forward now. Knight g5, knight d6. He reinforces the move of the c-pawn. If it rushes forward now, then it'll be quite hard to stop. So Magnus has to be careful. He plays rook c2. He puts his rook behind the pawn, just in case. Knight f5. FIDE offers a draw this way. Knight e6, rook c6, attacking the knight, king f7. Knight h6 check. This is an offer of a draw. On king e7, knight f5, repetition of moves. And Magnus thinks about what he should do. He doesn't need a draw, especially because Fabiano has 7 seconds left on the clock. King g6 is played by Magnus. On rook e6, he does not take the knight right away. He plays rook takes c3 check, and on king d2, rook c8 to make the knight stand still. The knight is in a trap and FIDE panics, doesn't know what to do. Actually, a simple solution was to play g4, but he plays king e3. Apparently he thought Magnus will take the knight right away, but he plays rook 8, and now the f6 pawn is safe. In the end, Magnus takes this knight and has 2 extra pawns with an absolutely won position. That's why FIDE resigns. And Hikaru made Dmitry Andrikhin's king have a little walk. He got as far as the f5 square, and here he has to give up the queen and rook takes e5. He resigns 1 move before the mate. On king f6, queen f4, and here white loses. Jan Nepomniachtchi in turn could not win against Hayek Martirosyan. And at the end of the 17 rounds, we have the following situation. Hikaru Nakamura and Magnus Carlsen are at the top of the standings, and they'll determine who will be the Blitz World Champion. And who would have thought that in the 18th round, Magnus Carlsen would meet a young and unknown international master from Uzbekistan, Mudkidin Madaminov. In the end, the game turned out to be not so easy. As we can see, Magnus got nothing in the opening. We have an equal position, absolutely equal material, and it's only skill that will decide everything. By the way, Magnus has little time on the clock, 10 seconds against his opponent's minute. And it would seem that there's no way to play to win. Magnus plays g5, fixing pawns on white squares, and here he shows his virtuoso endgame skill, his technique. On h6, h4, he simply fixes these weaknesses. If the opponent's pawns stand on the squares of his bishop's color, it restrains the bishop. It's easier for the white bishop to shoot at pawns that are located on the white squares, so all of Magnus's pawns are on black squares, as we can see. And as for his young opponent, we see that he lacks endgame technique. He should definitely work on that because, well, just watch. What nonsense is this? He moved the pawn to a4 to the white square. This is clearly a step in the wrong direction. It's a step into the abyss, and then also, well, you'll see. I don't want to spoil that. Meanwhile, he moves his bishop back and forth. He thought it was a fixation of the structure, but no, he just put all the pawns on white squares. It's absolutely horrible. In terms of endgame strategy, it's no good. Now all pawns can shoot at the white bishop, but the black bishop cannot attack any of the white's pawns, although still technically the position is equal from the computer's point of view. But it's much easier for white to play because he has a lot of objects to attack. It's only a matter of time before black makes a mistake. Magnus creates threats with every move. The king is ready to move to c5 or e5. So Mr. Madaminov balances like a tightrope walker, not to let the white king through. The move bishop to e4 looks like a respite, as if Magnus doesn't have a clear plan. Madaminov thinks about how to create an even stronger fortress. Well, you want to move the bishop back and forth, for example, bishop e2, bishop f1. But for some reason he wastes a lot of time and plays king e6, letting the king through. Apparently he's counting on the variant where the king takes all the pawns on the king's side. But there's obviously something wrong with his calculations. He just gave up a pawn. Well, yeah, he thought he'd keep the pawn on a4, but no. The king is on b4, the pawn will drop, and it's not clear why he gave up this pawn. To be honest, the position is already lost and he can't be saved here. Of course, he can't go into pawn endgame, but after bishop d5, Magnus plays bishop b3 and makes him do that, because the f7 pawn will drop as well. The position does not leave any chance for salvation at all. He exchanges the bishops, moves the king forward, but you can see that Magnus's pawns are much faster. He tries to hold the king, but after the move f4, the king's side is blocked, and Mukadin is forced to resign. But the big question is how are things going with Hikaru, because we come to the topic of our video. Alexey Sarana, a dark horse from Russia. His rating is only 2,660. No one really knows him. I'm not sure many of you guys watching my videos have heard of this name, but just look at what he's doing to Hikaru, to the Japanese samurai. 3 extra pawns, and here he just finishes him off. There's not really much to comment on. He moves his king forward. The position is technical. Hikaru looks for some odds, perpetual checks. Basically, he does the right thing. You have to play to the end. And here, after e5 check, the king moves to, it could move to f6 or h6. You can see that there's no more checks. If queen b6, then queen f6 with a queen exchange. Therefore, Hikaru has nothing left but to resign in this position and let Magnus Carlsen move forward. Let's take a look at the results of the 18th round. Magnus now leads the tournament table as he's the only one with 14 points. Hikaru and Haik are 1 point behind, and then there's a group of followers with 12.5 points, but we're not considering them. But in the next, 19th round, Alexey Sarana faced the world champion. Let's see what the young Russian talent did in this game. Alexey played d4. Magnus Carlsen responds symmetrically. d5, c4, e6, knight c3. Everything is solid so far because Magnus realizes the importance of this game. The Carlsbad pawn structure, bishop to f4. The standard move here is c6 to strengthen the center and, if necessary, move the queen to b6. Magnus makes calculated decisions but doesn't rush anywhere and considers options like bishop d6 or maybe knight h5 to attack this bishop right away. But no, c6 is a solid move. e3, bishop to f5, and after f3, the champion starts to make strange moves. He considers an unnecessary continuation. I think you know what I mean. He should have just played h6 or bishop d6 without fearing white's attack. After g4, move the bishop to g6, on h4 play either h6 or h5, no problems at all. But Magnus got confused here. Apparently he thought that there was some preparation on the opponent's side and played h5. But after bishop d3, exchange on d3, and the h5 pawn is now a chronic weakness. Black cannot castle long, and white can quickly turn the offensive with b4, a4, and if we castle, the h5 pawn becomes a weakness. And here comes the maneuver. Knight h6, knight c7. He makes 2 moves in a row with the knight. He could have brought the knight to d7 in 1 move. Magnus is clearly making mistakes in this game and does not respect his opponent. Let's see where this will lead. Alexey thinks. He sees that Magnus violates all opening principles, so he opens up the center with e4. And here, of course, Magnus should have shown some composure and simply played bishop e7, but no, he plays de, giving up the center completely. After knight e6, Alexey Sarana castles. The f-file is open, and white fully controls the center, having an advantage in development. We can conclude that the world champion played the opening in this game absolutely poorly. But as we know, he can always get out of any situation. Let's see what happens next. After h3, Magnus castles, ignoring the weakness of the h5 pawn. He's already mentally said goodbye to it. He's interested in a counterattack in the center. His knights seem to be attacking these pawns. Now he plans to play queen b6, rook d8, rook e8, and start attacking the pawns, then maybe capture one of them. Rook d1 is played by Alex. Very solid, straight according to the Soviet chess theory books. And e5 attacking the knight. Knight d5, there's a reason to think. The bishop hangs. Actually, it's been hanging almost since the game started, so what do we do here? Alex takes the d5 knight. After cd, he has to come up with a plan. The b2 pawn hangs. We can of course play it safe, protected by playing, for example, bishop c1. This is what most players would do. Bishop c1 looks pretty logical. You just protect the pawn and don't worry, or you could play b3. Let's see what decision Alexey makes. He does not think about defense, and goes only forward, knight g3 attacking the h5 pawn. You can see that clouds are gathering around the black king, a lot of white pieces concentrated on the king's side, the knight, bishop, everything actually. You can easily move the rook through d3 to the g-file, for example. Magnus understands that he does not want to give up this pawn. He plays g6. The bishop moves to h6, and Magnus sacrifices the quality. Queen takes b2 because in case of retreat, something could land on f7. Exchange on f8, white has an extra quality, and it seems that the a2 pawn is weak. d4 might potentially hang. You can find compensation, but of course this is already a desperate attack by the world champion. Rook b1 follows. On queen d4, he could take the central pawn. Magnus thinks about it, or he could take the a2 pawn. Two options, two choices. He decides to take this pawn. Though this decision is not the most optimal. The queen is now trapped, the bishop hangs. What do we do with the bishop? That's a good question. Well, we could move it to d8 or even to h4 aiming at the knight, but Magnus thought it was the perfect time to exchange queens, but it was a huge blunder. I think you've already guessed what's going on here. After this move he's down a piece and he'll lose one more piece. You can try to find this variation while Alex is thinking. After the exchange he plays rook a1, and that's it. The bishop has nowhere to go. Magnus even tried to move it to e7 automatically, but he sees that there's no squares. That's it. Magnus picked up the bishop from the board, not knowing where to put it, so he just resigned. And that's how Alexey Sarana knocked out two leaders at the end of the tournament. So who is this guy? Actually, he's not just a Grandmaster, he's only 23 years old. His rating is almost 2,700, and this year he even won the European Championship. So this guy might have a bright future ahead of him. Magnus's main competitors didn't really do well. Hikaru lost to Jan Krzysztof Duda. Hikaru Nakamura couldn't beat Alexander Shimonov. And after 19 rounds, Magnus is still in first place, with Hikaru trailing by half a point, and also Jan Krzysztof Duda and Alexey Sarana, who thanks to his two brilliant victories has joined the race for first place. In the next round, Magnus will play against Alexander Shimonov, but that's the topic of a separate video. In my next videos, we'll start talking about the latest news from the world of chess, namely the World Championship match between Jan Nepomniachtchi and Ding Liren. So stay tuned. And I thank you for your attention. Subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to keep up to date with all our latest videos. Keep playing and studying chess, and I'll see you soon.